So once again, thank you so much everyone for coming along for what I think is going to be a really great day two. We're going to kick off with an interesting question. Are we being incentivized to conduct research misconduct in sports science? And our presenter is Nick Diller from UCLA. Many of us will know him from his great book, The Skeptic's Guide to Sports Science. And Nick, with no further ado, I'll hand straight over to you. Thank you for coming.
All right, well, thank you for the kind introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are in the world. It's just after 7 a.m. here in LA. It's kind of overcast, which is making it a little bit harder to get going today, but I'm excited to be here. I want to say a big thank you to Stork for the kind invitation. You know, I'm sure this has been said already, but Stork are doing great work. You know, we're all here because we are advocates of, obviously, transparency and openness in kinesiology. This is something that we I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but this is something that we have to encourage our colleagues to pursue, and our graduates and our undergraduates as well, because I honestly do feel that the future of our discipline depends on, you know, us advocating more ardently for transparency and openness. And let me just share my screen before I get going too much. All right, so just give me a thumbs up if you can see the screen okay. All right, I'm going to use the laser pointer. So I know that I've chosen something of a provocative title here, and I'm going to spend the next, I don't know, 35, 40 minutes trying to convince you that the title is justified. And a caveat before we start is that I am going to sort of paint a bit of a negative picture of the world of kinesiology in this talk. And I don't mean to, because actually the vast majority of people that work in this industry, in this discipline, are good scientists and care about the quality of the work and are doing great things. But, you know, there are just in the UK, I don't know the stats in the US, but just in the UK alone, there are something like 10,000 graduates in sport and exercise science every year. And even if 1% of them are not of a particularly good standard or are deliberately engaging in what we call questionable research practices, that 1% actually reflects quite a large number of people and potential scientists. So this is something that we have to be aware of. So before I get into the talk proper, let me just give you a little bit of background on me so you know where I'm coming from. I have an undergraduate degree in sport and exercise science and a master's in exercise physiology. Got both of those from the University of Hertfordshire, which is just outside North London. And I knew at that time that I wanted to specialize in high performance sport. I think if you ran a poll with undergraduate students, probably 80 to 90% of them would probably tell you that they want to work in high performance sport, but I was one of the few that actually managed to accomplish it. And after a couple of years of gaining experience, I managed to land a job at the English Institute of Sport. This is Bisham Abbey in the southeast of England. And I worked with some of the UK's Olympic performance programs, specifically UK Athletics, with whom I became BASIS accredited, and the GB Flatwater Kayak Squad. I left there in 2009 to pursue my PhD at Brunel University in West London. That was in human respiratory physiology. And after a few short stints at the GSK Human Performance Lab and Kingston University, London, where I was an assistant professor, I joined Sheffield Hallam University in Yorkshire, where I was an associate professor for 4 years. That was my previous appointment. I now reside at Harbour UCLA, where I'm a senior research fellow in exercise physiology and respiratory medicine. I've spent the last at least 10 years of my life trying to unify the worlds of critical thinking and scientific skepticism and the world of health and wellness, because there is a huge disparity between the two. And that's kind of led me naturally to become interested in the standards of practice within exercise science as a discipline. And that's obviously the theme of this summit. So I'm going to start by talking about overt scientific misconduct. That's not the theme of the talk, but it's important to touch on this. Now, one of the largest misconduct cases on record involved a US-based physiologist, Eric Perlman, an obesity specialist, who admitted falsifying data in 10 published articles and 17 grant applications worth nearly $3 million. He was eventually sentenced to 1 year in prison for his good work. And it was widely discussed in the mainstream media and in the scientific literature as well. Now, of course, misconduct, again, we're talking about overt misconduct here. It's not limited to individual scientists, but it can involve large corporations and science organizations even. The Coca-Cola company started to suffer a decline in the consumption of sugary beverages because consumers were starting to worry about the surging obesity rates. And they formed an organization some years ago to emphasize the fact that exercise is the best way to control obesity and actually to play down the importance of cutting calories. We know that both are important. And if anything, controlling for dietary factors might even be more important. But the new organization was called the Global Energy Balance Network, and it was fronted by some respected scientists who said that Coca-Cola would have no control over what they studied or what they said. But then this analysis that you can see here that was published in PLOS Medicine found that studies that were financed by Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, the American Beverage Association were 5 times more likely to find no link between sugary drinks and weight gain than studies that reported no industry sponsored or financial conflicts of interest. So this can be considered, if not overt scientific misconduct, certainly questionable research practice. And this kind of misconduct or questionable practice leads to retractions in the literature. So the number of papers that are retracted from biomedical related fields has increased exponentially in the past decade, even when you account for increases in the total number of published articles. So this analysis by Moylan and colleagues from 2016 shows, okay, so we have this steady rise in the number of publications to biomedical journals. You kind of expect that with increased funding and increased attention on this kind of stuff. But actually the number of retractions jumped exponentially in about 2014. So the number of retractions is actually outpacing, relatively speaking, the number of new publications. We see the same kind of thing in the exercise sciences. This analysis by Cardis and colleagues found that a total of 52 retracted publications and their retraction notices were identified for sports sciences, and the majority of these were published and retracted in the last decade. So we see this with numerous other scientific disciplines. And it goes without saying that misconduct that leads to retractions like this can not only damage the credibility of the field, but it might also negatively impact on our ability to do our jobs if we're working as practitioners with clients, with athletes, and it might also negatively impact on graduate employment prospects. So that's overt misconduct. Now, a phenomenon of arguably even greater concern than overt scientific misconduct is this notion of questionable research practices, which I know has been discussed yesterday. I'm going to explore that a little bit more now. It's more subtle and deep-rooted in our institutional norms than overt misconduct. And these QRPs might do more long-term harm to scientific inquiry than overt misconduct, because misconduct leads to these often sensational cases, court cases and retractions, whereas QRPs are occurring every day and often they slip under the radar. Now, QRPs are introduced either deliberately or inadvertently into study design. So, for example, biased experiments in data collection. So an example could be insufficient blinding of subjects. In data analysis, so incorrect or inappropriate statistics. Data reporting, so like post hoc hypothesizing or harking, which I'm going to talk about soon. And all of these lead to biased results and conclusions. By manipulating research findings in one direction or another, QRPs create a system in which honest researchers are actually at a competitive disadvantage. And some authors have described QRPs for this reason as the steroids of scientific competition, which I think is an apt analogy. So let's talk about some of the manifestations of QRPs in, I've put exercise science research, I've put exercise in parentheses because unfortunately there isn't loads of data specific to the exercise sciences. A lot of the data I'm going to show you is quite general. I'm going to pick out specific examples from our discipline, but there's no reason to think that this would be any different in exercise science. And actually, it's just a call for more research to identify the extent of the problem. Because the implications of QRPs are broad. they can undermine the authenticity of research findings, prevent their accurate interpretation. It could inhibit the attainment of replicable science. So we have this replication crisis in exercise science. And to some degree, the lack of ambiguity the ambiguity and the lack of transparency in exercise science is being exploited by the commercial health and wellness industry to sell products and practices that are poorly evidenced. So the emission rates of data fabrication and falsification are pretty low, but are not negligible. This analysis by Finelli from, is a little bit old now, so the numbers may have changed, but suggest that the rates of fabrication and falsification were about 2%. But when we look at the rates of questionable research practices, this study looked at 2,000 scientists at major US universities, reported a prevalence of 78% for failing to report all dependent variables, which is a QRP, 72% for collecting more data after assessing whether the initial results were significant, and 39% for rounding down p-values. And they reported 9%, as you can see here, for data falsification, which is considerably higher than what was reported by Finelli. But again, John and colleagues show that the rates, the self-reported rates of QRPs are considerably higher than what we see for overt scientific misconduct. And this, of course, at least in part, leads to this high positive result rate. So the notion that researchers are less likely to submit and journals are less likely to accept papers that report negative or neutral outcomes, this is not anything new, certainly not new in exercise science. But it's clear that in most scientific disciplines, this leads to a skewed positive result rate. So studies have shown a positive relationship between study outcomes and the decision to submit a manuscript for review. This is the well-known file draw problem, whereby studies that have neutral or negative results tend to be just put in the filing cabinet and never heard of again. They just gather dust. And it leads to this publication bias and non-replicable research. In the exercise-related fields, the positive result rate has been reported as high as around 82% in sports medicine, higher in psychology, in exercise science journals specifically, around 81%. And I don't think that we should read too much into the discrepancy between these analyses, because anything above 80% can be considered to be skewed. The notion that researchers, as I said, are likely to submit and are less likely to submit, and journals are less likely to accept papers that report negative or neutral outcomes, is obviously highly prevalent in exercise-related disciplines. Now, again, we're talking about the manifestations of questionable research practices, and another manifestation is an over-reliance on p-values. Again, this was touched upon in some of the talks yesterday, but I'm going to give you an example from an exercise-related study that demonstrates this problem really nicely. So in this study, Blumenthal and colleagues in 2019 studied 160 males and females, and they randomized them to either a group that conducted aerobic exercise training or a group that conducted what they call DASH, or dietary approaches to stop hypertension. There was also a combined exercise and nutrition group and a separate control group who did nothing but health education. And then one of the main dependent variables was executive function. And they looked at this with a composite value. I won't go into the details of how they did that. But one of their main outcomes was that aerobic exercise significantly improved executive function with a p-value of 0.046. But the dietary interventions did not significantly affect executive function with a p-value of 0.059, despite identical effect sizes between the two groups. And they didn't discuss this in the context in which it was deserved. They stated it outright in their abstract and in the discussion that aerobic exercise evoked this significant improvement, but dietary interventions did not. And so, and this is, this is just using an arbitrary p-value of 0.05. Now, failing to correct for multiple comparisons is another example of a questionable research practice, and it is, associated with either a deliberate attempt to present findings as being significant when they otherwise may not be, and or it's just naivety, statistical naivety, which either one of those is not really justifiable in modern science. And this again was mentioned yesterday, but I'm going to focus on a different aspect of the paper. So this is a letter to the editor that I published in the International Journal of Sport Nutrition and Exercise Metabolism earlier this month, actually. And it was associated with this study, Association of Vitamin D Supplementation in Cardiorespiratory Fitness, that was published by Medeiros et al. Back in January. And again, we're going to focus on one aspect of the study where they failed to correct for multiple comparisons. So they used this arbitrary alpha level of 0.05, which most scientific studies do. And when you use this arbitrary alpha level, the chances of a type 1 error, which is obviously a false positive, increases with the number of independent statistics tests that you do. So conducting 2 independent statistics tests and evaluating each with 0.05 inflates alpha to about 10%. If you do 3 tests, it increases alpha to about 14%. Now, if you look at the main outcome variables in this study by Medeiros et al., they assess increases in strength using hand grip dynamometry. So they looked at left and right hand dynamometry, and they found in the control group, who had no intervention at all, that there was no change pre to post intervention in either right hand grip strength or left hand grip strength. You can see the p-values here are around 0.6. In the intervention group, who were supplemented with low dose vitamin D for 60 days, there was no increase in hand grip strength in the right hand. You can see the p-value of 0.16. But in the left hand, there was a significant pre to post intervention increase in hand grip strength, 0.007. Now, apart from the fact that the increase in grip strength was unilateral, so they found an increase in grip strength in the left hand, but not the right hand, without offering any explanation for that, they reported this as a real outcome. They mentioned in the abstract and in the discussion in their conclusions that supplementing with vitamin D can improve grip strength in untrained middle-aged adults. But you have to, look at the methods section to discover that they conducted more than 14 independent t-tests here without any correction for family-wise error. And this increases the alpha to above 50%. So in other words, the likelihood of a false positive in this study was greater than chance. And if you apply a simple Bonferroni adjustment to these results, which is specifically designed for sample sizes more than 30, which is what they had here, you can see n of 37, then the difference in hand grip strength was no longer significant at a p-value of 0.098. So just doing some good statistical analyses would in fact negate the positive change that they saw here in hand grip strength. Another QRP is small sample sizes and small effects. And I'm going to pick on the HIT literature now, the high intensity interval training. And this is wildly popular at the moment for various reasons. And although there's a lot of good research being done in HIT related studies, a lot of this stuff is non-replicable. For instance, this relatively recent meta-analysis explored the effectiveness of HIT training versus moderate intensity continuous exercise for improving cardiorespiratory fitness. And they looked at 48 different studies and concluded that HIT training was more effective, but actually the median sample size per group was 10. So these are very low sample sizes. In this instance, the small sample sizes were also used to study small to medium effect sizes. So there's a pooled effect size of 0.4. And most of the studies here, so around 90%, exhibited statistical power in the range of 0 to 20%, which is really, really poor, really paltry. And so small sample sizes being used to study small effects leading to low statistical power, these studies are largely non-replicable. The study design also needs to be considered, so not accounting for placebo effects. The placebo-controlled trials are the benchmark of clinical research into drugs and ergogenic aids. This was a study that Brian Saunders was involved with, and they found, among other things, that placebo may contribute up to 25% of the total intervention effect for supplements like extracellular buffers, up to around 60% for the intervention effects of caffeine supplements, but that placebo effects influence the subjective response to all kinds of things, and that interventional studies in exercise science must employ a no intervention control arm to differentiate between physiological and psychobiological effects. And a lot of the time they don't do that. So not accounting for placebo effects in the study design, either deliberately or inadvertently, can be considered a QRP. Other QRPs that I won't delve into, just for the sake of brevity, include not reporting effect sizes. Depending on the literature that you look at, effect sizes are reported somewhere between 30 and 80% of the time in exercise science related literature. That's quite a span, but again, it depends on the analysis that you look at. Non-reporting or misreporting of variance. A lot of studies report the standard error of the mean as variance, and that is the SEM is not variance, standard deviation is variance, and p-hacking, so inappropriately manipulating your statistics to evoke a certain outcome or an anticipated outcome. But this is where I get to the crux of the talk, because we want to understand, we've looked at what QRPs are manifesting in science and exercise science research, and we want to understand the incentives that are underpinning QRPs, because this is really important. So some commentators argue that an academic must publish or perish, and this is an idiom that everyone will be familiar with. And idioms like publish or perish overemphasize the need to create knowledge through research, which is obviously important, it's crucial to our discipline, but it potentially overemphasizes this. The concept is widespread in higher education institutions all around the world. It serves to keep staff constantly engaged with relevant knowledge in their respective fields, but the concern is that it emboldens an ethos of quantity over quality. And according to this viewpoint, research publications are the most important factor in determining whether an academic gets employed or promoted or even acknowledged or hired in our discipline. And this is a profound problem. When I think back to being a doctoral researcher at Brunel, one of my earliest memories of this notion of publish or perish was a senior academic said to me, when you finish your PhD, you need to, as soon as possible, try and get 4 published papers in good science journals. And the reason that it's 4 papers, anybody that's listening from the UK will understand that we have something in the UK called the Research Excellence Framework, or the REF, and this occurs every 4 to 5 years or so. And it's basically a research audit whereby universities are essentially audited on their contributions to scientific research. And the more academic staff that they can submit to the REF, the more money they get back in return. So it's literally a one huge cash grab for many universities. And so academics can be submitted to the REF generally if they have 4 good science publications, and the better the papers and the more high impact those papers. And if they're published in journals with a high impact factor, this all, leads to better ratings in the REF. And so this was impressed upon me very early on, and it was kind of implied that I'm not really employable unless I have 4 good science papers. We don't really have such a system in the US, but the ethos of publish or perish is still very much prevalent. So universities and other academic institutions, academic journals are now equally involved in this pervasive culture of publish or perish. They face budgetary pressures. Institutions have got to they depend on prestige to attract research funding and to attract new students as well. And one of the best ways to do that is by publishing lots of papers in highly visible, prestigious journals. And for the journals, the increase in submissions from academic researchers, who are in turn under pressure to get published, raises their operating costs, and they get more money from doing so. And in addition, with so many new journals being published every year, the pressure to maintain prominence via impact scores and other measures of perceived rank, again, contributes to this circular process. In a survey of nearly 7,000 scientists from various scientific disciplines, publication pressures associated positively with the frequency of questionable research practices, as did being a doctoral candidate or being a junior researcher, as you can see in this column here, as did, interestingly enough, as did being male. So this effect seemed to affect males more than females. I'm going to come back to this idea in a minute, but when we look at the composite QRP rating score, sorry, this is a QRP rating score relating to work, publication, or funding pressures. The pressures were considered to be higher by postdoctoral researchers and assistant professors than they were in associate or full professors. Whether that's your perception or not is a different story, but that's what they found in this study. The number of original manuscripts as a result submitted to, in this case, the sports performance section of the Journal of Sports Sciences has increased by around 34% between 2017 and 2020. And in this editorial, they suggested that there are many factors that might contribute to this, including, okay, increased popularity of the journal, but this notion of publish or perish. They also suggested that, and I'm quoting here, perverse incentives, metrification of the system, and hyper competition that drives academics and researchers to prioritize quantity over quality. So that's a direct quote from the editorial. And we see this in the medical literature as well. In this analysis of 315 medical scientists, they were surveyed about their QRPs, and 15% of them admitted fabricating or manipulating data, and they stated that publication pressures were a major cause. And in addition, publication pressure was strongly and significantly associated with a composite misconduct severity score. So we're seeing this in all science, in all science fields, not just exercise science, but in the medical literature as well. The increased pressure to publish has, at least in part, contributed to an increase in submission rates to pay to publish and or predatory journals. And obviously these are two distinct entities. And the popularity of these pay to publish journals, as I've said, has increased exponentially. You can see that on the y-axis here, this is the number of articles that have been published. And in the last decade, or at least between 2010 and 2015, this has increased, as I said, exponentially. The publication fee, the mean publication fee, was not nearly as much as you'd think. It was about $178 on average. And the mean time from submission of the paper to publication was just over 8 weeks. So in many instances, this is very cheap. It's very easy to do. It's very accessible, and the delay from submission to publication is relatively short. And in this editorial by Shannon Björk from 2015, they stated that, unlike many writings about the phenomenon, we believe that most authors are not necessarily tricked into publishing in predatory journals. They probably submit to them well aware of the circumstances and take a calculated risk that experts who evaluated their publication list will not bother to check the journal credentials. Hence, we do not uncritically see the authors as unknowing victims. That's why this idea of predatory journals has been put in quotes, because I think in many cases, the pressure to publish and this idea of publish or perish is forcing researchers to publish in these, quote unquote, predatory journals or pay to publish outlets that offer very quick turnaround times and little to no peer review process. This also leads to salami slicing. Again, the pressure to publish, the pressure for quantification metrics, H-index and so forth, leads researchers to salami slice their data. So this is when they split data from one research study into smaller units, each of which is then submitted and in most cases published separately in different journals. So whereas previously a single study led to the submission of one single comprehensive, robust article, the data is now going to be subdivided into several manuscripts, which are then subsequently submitted to different journals. So the prevalence of salami slicing, although it's difficult to determine, is not is not insignificant. Salami slicing is driven by the author's desire or need to achieve a larger number of publications to gain recognition, move up the academic career ladder, attract research funds, and so forth. Self-citations is another one that we see a lot. Again, this all stems from the pressure to publish a large number of studies. So these citation metrics are widely used and misused to inflate H-indexes and other career profiles. Ioannidis and others created a publicly available database of more than 100,000 top scientists from different fields that provides standardized information on citation numbers and H-indexes and so on. And it has some really revealing results. Some of you may have seen this. Again, it's publicly available. So I pored over this database for some time and looked at a few trends. So again, to further emphasize how publication pressures and performance metrics might lead to QRPs, I got hold of this database, and this is the, I plotted the citation numbers from the top 250 most highly cited researchers in sports sciences. So this goes up to 2019. I actually think it's been updated since then, but it will serve the point. So the mean citation number of the top 250 is about 7,000 around here. And for context, the infamous Professor Timothy Noakes is around 6th place around here with around 7,000 citations. Mike Gleason, who's an immunologist, is in 91st place. Stephen Blair, you can see, is this outlier here. He's got more than 70,000 citations. He really skews the data. Now, if we plot the same authors or the same researchers in the same order, in accordance with the percentage of their total citations that are self-citations, we see an interesting outcome. So the mean percentage of self-citations is 14%. Okay, so that is 14% of the total citations are self-citations. The standard deviation was about 7. Okay, you can see that would be around, well, 14% is about here. So visually, that's fairly intuitive. Now, self-citations are normal and expected because authors tend to build a body of work and progress through a research theme. So that's not a problem. So it's important that they self-cite and everyone does it. However, some researchers are clearly anomalous. So one of these researchers here in about 90th position has a self-citation rate above 30%, which is 2 standard deviations of the mean. Another is 5 standard deviations of the mean. One researcher here has 66% self-citation rate, which is 8 standard deviations of the mean. This individual holds the rank of professor, has an H-index of around 30. And this is evidence enough that researchers consider these quantitative performance metrics as important to their career progression, so much so that they're willing to self-cite at anomalous rates. And this is obviously one way of inflating the H-index. So this leads to artificially inflated impact factors. So to chase these quantitative metrics, researchers often prioritize publishing in journals with high impact factors, even though we all know that impact factor is not really representative of the quality of individual studies or even citation numbers. Some of the problems with impact factors that you'll all be familiar with: impact factors are not statistically representative of individual articles. Review articles skew the results. So of course, if you have one review that cites a large number of studies, it's going to skew the impact factor. Extensive articles with many citations have are going to yield a high impact factor. It includes self-citations, which we've just discussed. Books don't count. Databases primarily index articles in English, which again is further bias. It obviously depends on fluctuations in a particular area of study. Paid to publish journals are included in these kinds of metrics. There is obviously a tight scope, or esoteric subjects tend to have very low impact factors. So physics, for example, physics journals often have low impact factors. Editors may give preference to articles that are more likely to be cited to, again, inflate their impact, the impact factor of the journal, and the low impact factor of a journal can lead to low submissions. And as we've just seen, one highly cited article can boost the impact factor. Just to give you an example of this, this is the journal ACTA CRYSTALLOGRAPHICA, section A. Don't be surprised if you haven't heard of this. The AC publishes studies in the practice and theory of areas of structural science. So crystallography, nanocrystals, metacrystals, amorphous materials and things. And you can see here that their impact factor trundled along at sort of 2 to 3. And in about 2008, 2009, there was this colossal jump in impact factor, well above 40, above what we saw in Nature at the time. And that was all because there was this one study that they published by George Sheldrake that was cited more than 78,000 times. And so this one study that was really highly cited artificially inflated the impact factor of the journal. I just thought that was a wonderful case study. There are financial incentives as well that might evoke questionable research practices in researchers. So the sports nutrition market is predicted to be worth an estimated $35 billion worldwide within the next couple of years. And this has led to, or at least partially led to, an increase in sports supplement research. So this analysis by Anna Kiss and colleagues looked at structure and trends of international sports nutrition research. And generally what we see is that in the last couple of decades, there has been this dramatic increase in the number of studies that have been associated with sports supplements. So in 2020 alone, there were more than 800 studies that looked at sports supplements. And I'm not suggesting that the exercise science researchers are necessarily benefiting financially in all cases from sports supplement research, but it won't be difficult to bring to mind an exercise scientist who is in some way benefiting from either marketing their own supplements or endorsing sports supplements. HIT research, as I mentioned earlier, is another example. The number of studies that are published to journals relating to HIT research has increased exponentially in the last decade. And the commercial interest in HIT has spawned dozens of books and training programs and podcasts that are devoted to HIT, which has become something of a subculture in itself. Many of the books have been written by established exercise scientists. And as I mentioned earlier, much of the HIT literature is undeserving of the enormous attention. Again, I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater here. There is some good research being done in HIT, but as I mentioned, in this one example, the mean sample size was 10, the pooled effect size was 0.4, and the average statistical power was less than 20% in most studies. So we have to keep this in mind. So this idea of, so we have publication pressures, funding pressures, quantitative metrics. We are driven by these three things in a very real way. And these things, more often than not, dictate the course of our careers. So the same factors that together denote scientific fitness in the broadest sense are the same factors that are very often tempting some researchers to engage in questionable research practices. So to finish, I want to talk about reform. How do we address some of these issues? And unfortunately, this is the shortest part of my talk because I'm not sure that there are very many clear ways to address this, certainly not something that can be addressed in the last 10 minutes of a talk. But we can start by treating the manifestations of QRPs. So specific to the issue of self-citation, this poll in Nature asked readers to consider what, if anything, should be done to curb excessive citation numbers. Respondents said, that citation-based metrics should exclude self-citations. And I completely agree. It seems like a simple adjustment that would go some way to curbing the high rates of self-citation. This large analysis looked at the quality of manuscripts that made use of study pre-registration. Now, of course, pre-registering studies is obligatory in most clinical trials and other areas of medical science, but it's almost unheard of in the exercise sciences. So this study got over 350 researchers to peer review nearly 120 papers, 60 of which had been pre-registered and 60 of which had not. And they designed this system that you can see here comprising 19 different metrics that were used to quantify the quality of the paper. And what they found was that registered reports outperformed comparison papers in all 19 criteria. So in terms of the rigorousness of the methods, the quality of the methods, the rigorousness of the analysis, the overall quality of the paper, In each of these 19 metrics, the pre-registered study was considered to be of superior quality. And so this is something that we need to start advocating more in exercise science research. Another suggestion is the use of badges, not badgers, but badges proposed in several papers to act as an incentive to good practice. So authors would have this symbol on the left here printed on their published papers when they made raw data readily available. They would have this symbol published when the data and the methods were openly transparent, and this symbol when the report was pre-registered. And this study of papers that were published in the journal Psychological Science before and after badges were introduced as an incentive, you can see in this red line here. We don't know that this is necessarily cause and effect, but you can see the percentage of articles that were reporting available data. It was trending upwards anyway, but they suggest that actually using these kinds of badges, these symbols as an incentive may increase the openness and transparency in data reporting. Another way of improving transparency in published data that's being proposed for the first time by me right now is to ask authors to submit the previously published or previously approved ethics application or ethics protocol alongside the finished manuscripts. Now, in most cases, in fact, in all cases, you can't perform a study without having prior ethical approval. That's considered to be misconduct. So if you ask authors to submit the previously approved ethics document alongside their published manuscript or their manuscript that's being reviewed, this would allow reviewers or journal editors or admin assistants to check the disparities between the aims and objectives that are stated in the two documents. So notwithstanding that this would be an additional administrative burden, the check would allow for greater transparency in study reporting and help to mitigate the post hoc derivation or modification of study aims, particularly in interventional type research. Now, many QRPs manifest as inappropriate or incorrect statistics, and often this can result through earnest error or statistical naivety rather than fraud or malintent. This is stated quite bluntly by Hanlon's razor. Never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. Not my words, Hanlon's words, but nevertheless, often statistical naivety contributes to QRPs. I've been guilty of this myself. I have to put my hands up. Earlier on in my publishing career, especially shortly after my PhD, I published studies that basically just had p-values. I didn't understand the importance of reporting effect sizes and confidence intervals. And this is something that needs to change. So better education on statistical procedures and their importance for producing valid results needs to be formally integrated into under and postgraduate programs. And other ideas for improving transparency to overcome false positivity rates. A disclosure-based solution for prospective manuscripts has been proposed, whereby authors and reviewers adhere to a checklist that ensures transparency in methods and results. And both of these analyses by Ernest and Fremantle suggested a similar idea of an established hierarchy of aims. So encouraging authors to be really transparent with their aims and specifically using a prioritized analysis schema. And improving accuracy, specifically reducing the prevalence of statistical errors. There have been numerous calls for better standards of reporting, and just see these two editorials in prominent journals. The responsibility for enforcing this ultimately falls to journal editors and reviewers. They are responsible for rebuilding trust in research. They need to enforce stronger policies and enforce more robust statistical reporting and statistical procedures in the studies that they accept for publication. But importantly, despite all of these very coherent recommendations and perennial calls for better standards of reporting, QRPs still persist. And this suggests that treating the superficial manifestations of QRPs through these aforementioned strategies may not be sufficient to evoke long-term behavior change. And this is why we need to try and do something to treat the incentives of QRPs. So I mentioned this earlier. I know part of the issue is the current emphasis on quantity over quality. Publication and funding pressures in scientists were rated as higher in postdoctoral researchers and assistant professors than associate and full professors. And this can be partially addressed by urging researchers to pursue long-term projects that are both robust and that can make a profound scientific contribution rather than just short-term high volume outputs of relatively questionable quality. And the overarching aim is to emphasize quality of research over quality. Now, we have to be careful and just try and strike a balance in this regard, because this model proposed by Edwards and Roy shows that an overemphasis on quality in scientific publishing manifests as very stringent and overly cautious systems that are characterized by multiple blinded studies and mandatory replication of results, which is, it's kind of unreasonable. By contrast, a frivolous emphasis on quantity would sacrifice scientific rigor. But both extremes, importantly, would likely slow the attainment of scientific knowledge. There has to be a balance. So assuming the goal of research is to promote scientific progress, optimum productivity is likely to be found by carefully balancing research quantity and quality, and that's something that needs to be considered carefully. And finally, the current system of exercise science research and science research in general treats manuscript publication in journals as the framework for knowledge dissemination and ultimately career advancement, and an urgent culture change is needed. So in order to shift the emphasis away from the endpoint of manuscript publication, we need to, more carefully consider open access publishing, public repositories. These things need to be further embraced or at least discussed as an alternative means of disseminating methods and data. Peer review and peer review journals would still be available for those who wish to use them, but this kind of proposed system would diminish the incentive to publish as the sole means of knowledge dissemination. And this kind of knowledge building incentive system would hopefully, I think in the long term, produce research that had a demonstrably meaningful impact on theory or practice, rather than just merely having a paper accepted for publication to have another, to chalk up another study on your PubMed profile. Just look at the number of COVID-related papers that have been published in the last few years that haven't improved policy and haven't improved patient outcomes, haven't improved our understanding of disease pathology, and still the number of COVID-related papers continues to rise. So in other words, the central focus must be on, I guess, what we could call it altruistic values and good science, rather than performance metrics. This strategy needs to be complemented with a system that, supports the next generation of scientists in striking a healthy balance between, internal accuracy motives like learning and publishing robust data, and purely professional ones. So the take-home messages then are, I'd like this to be a call to action. QRPs are highly prevalent in exercise science. We need more data to determine the extent of the problem, but I am guessing it's going to be relatively high. We need better education on QRPs. We need an urgent shift in culture away from quantitative metrics and more towards altruistic incentives to improve transparency and openness in the field. Just before I finish, you can find out more about me and the work that I do on my website, nbtiller.com. I've collated all of my stuff in research and skepticism. You can find out more about my book there as well. Follow me on Twitter for all the good stuff at nbtiller, and my book, The Skeptic's Guide to Sports Science, as well, is available wherever you buy your books. Thank you for your attention. I hope you found it of interest, and hopefully there's a bit of time for some questions. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nick. And I think in terms of the theme for today and indeed the entire event, a call to action is exactly what we're looking for. And that was a really, really great way to get us kicked off. I'm trying to decide now. As you will see in the chat, we have a lot of questions. We've got a lot of forward and back. We've got a lot of things to consider. However, our next talk is due to start in 3 minutes, so I'm a little scared that if we start, we won't stop. So what I would suggest, we have the chats. We're going to share them. Nick, perhaps if it's okay with you, if you have time to perhaps have a look through some of those questions and respond there. We might continue moving, because otherwise there's some of these big questions. Once we start, we won't stop. One thing I'd also like to just mention to everyone is at the end of the day today,